Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Dave Paunesku.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about what we can do to unfix our mindsets. I'd like to start by telling you a story about an influential moment in the life of a person who has gone on to influence countless others, myself included. And that person is Professor Carol Dweck. A long time ago now, Professor Dweck was studying how kids respond to challenging situations. To do this, she gave a group of 10-year-olds some very challenging problems, some problems that she knew would be far too hard for most of them to solve. She wanted to see, in other words, what they would do when they encountered this difficulty. Well, unsurprisingly, many kids got frustrated pretty quickly. They wanted to give up. They wanted to disengage and stop working on these problems. But some of the kids had a very different reaction. They said things like, "Oh boy, I love a challenge. And I was hoping this would be informative." They wanted to keep trying at this very difficult task. They shocked Professor Dweck. What was different about these students, she wondered? How is it that in the face of this challenge, they perked up, they got excited when so many others wanted to give up and shut down? Well, over the coming years, Professor Dweck and her colleagues came to identify one key source of this difference. So she and her colleagues found that people vary a great deal in how they think about intelligence. They found that some people think about intelligence as something that's fixed, something like eye color. Whatever you're born with is what you have for the rest of your life. There's nothing you can do to change it. They called this the fixed mindset because it suggests a fixed conception of intelligence. Other people, on the other hand, had what they called a growth mindset. They had the idea that intelligence is something like a muscle, that it's something that you can grow through effort and by using the right kinds of strategies. In other words, it's something you can grow if you give your brain a good workout. So let's think back to the 10-year-olds who were struggling with Dr. Dweck's challenging problems. Let's imagine how a student with a fixed mindset might have thought about what was happening when he encountered this really challenging problem. Well, he might have thought, boy, this problem is way too hard for me. There's no way I could do it. It would make sense for him to give up because clearly this isn't something he's good at. Or let's give him a little bit more credit. Let's say he thinks, well, maybe if I could figure this out if I worked at it for a really long time. But what would be the point? Obviously, I'm not good at these kind of problems. Obviously, I'm not smart enough to really do this, because if I were smart, if I were a natural at this, I could get it no sweat right away. So even though the student might think that he could do this, he doesn't exactly sound excited by the prospect of trying. Because to him, having to try so hard would just be a reminder that he doesn't have that inborn talent, that he's not natural at doing this kind of thing. So ask yourself, would a student who believes something like this have gotten excited about doing these challenging problems? I bet most of you would agree that he probably wouldn't. Now let's imagine a student with a growth mindset, a student who believes that he can make himself smarter by working out his brain. How might he react to a challenging problem like this? What might he think? Well, he might think something like, well, these problems are really hard, and that means that they're going to give my brain a good workout and make me smarter. So unlike the fixed mindset student, the growth mindset student doesn't just think he can do this, he actually has a reason to be excited about it. To him, the hard work of solving this problem wouldn't just be some kind of pointless toil. It wouldn't be meaningless or embarrassing. Quite to the contrary, it would be an opportunity for him to grow his abilities. Well, to better understand how these two mindsets affect a whole constellation of factors regarding the way students approach school, Carol Dweck and two of her colleagues surveyed over 300 seventh graders in New York City public schools. They asked these students whether or not they thought intelligence is fixed or malleable. In other words, they asked them what kind of mindset they have. And then they asked them questions about their goals in school, about what they think effort really means, what it means when you have to try hard, and how they would react to a failure experience in school. What they said revealed how these two mindsets can influence someone's whole orientation towards learning and towards challenges. So on the topic of goals, students who had a fixed mindset said essentially that their goal in school was to look smart. They endorsed statements like, the main thing I want to do, when I do my schoolwork is to show how good I am at it. And of course, that makes a lot of sense because from their perspective, from their standpoint, your intelligence isn't something you can change. The most you can hope to do in school is to show how good you already are at it. School isn't a place where you develop yourself. It's just a place where you kind of get to reveal, where you get to get sorted according to how good you already are. Students who had a growth mindset, on the other hand, had a very different orientation. They said that their main goal in school was to learn. They said things like, it's much more important for me to learn things in my classes than it is to get the best grades. What about their interpretations of effort? Well, to students who had a fixed mindset, effort meant they were incapable. They said things like, when I work hard in my classes, it makes me feel like I'm not very smart. In other words, they had this kind of a Homer Simpson mentality, that trying is the first step towards failure. Well, what did having to try hard mean to growth mindset students? It was pretty different. To them, effort meant, if you had to try hard at something, that meant that you were making yourself smarter, that you were improving yourself. So they said things like, the harder you work at something, the better you'll be at it. And finally, they asked students about their reactions to failure. They asked them, if they studied for a quiz, but they failed that quiz anyway, what would they do? Well, the students with a fixed mindset said they would have a helpless response pattern. Now, of course, they didn't use the term helpless, but they said things like, I would spend less time on this subject from now on. I would try to never take this subject again. Or even, I would try to cheat on the next test. And from their perspective, these kind of responses actually make sense because they think, hey, if you studied and you didn't get it, then obviously you're not good at this. The most you can hope to do is never do this subject again, or maybe even cheat. Students with a growth mindset, on the other hand, had a resilient perspective. They said they would work harder in this class from now on. They said they would spend more time studying for the tests. So to summarize, students who had a growth mindset had a pretty different outlook on all these different things that are important in school. They wanted to focus on learning. They saw that effort is how you improve yourself, and they were resilient when they encountered a setback. So while fixed mindset students were worried about where they are and what that means about them, they were worried about how people might judge them and how they might judge themselves, students who had a growth mindset were asking themselves what they could do to get better, what they could do to put themselves on an upward trajectory. So did they actually get better? Did they actually do better than the fixed mindset students? You bet. So many studies now have documented a strong relationship between students' mindsets and their academic performance. And this is especially true in challenging courses, in courses like math or science, where students really have to struggle in order to do well. That's when these beliefs are most important, because that's when students with a fixed mindset are tempted to give up, and students with a growth mindset see a learning opportunity, a way to improve themselves. Unsurprisingly, students with a growth mindset are also more likely to take more challenging courses in the first place, because they see those courses as an opportunity for improvement. Well, my favorite study to explore the relationship between mindsets and learning outcomes was conducted pretty recently by Susana Claro, who's a graduate student at the Stanford School of Education, by Carol Dweck, and by myself. And in this study, we managed to get the Chilean Ministry of Education to incorporate an assessment of mindset into their national achievement test that all the 10th graders in the whole nation of Chile take. So we got back a data set that was pretty neat. It had all of the test scores, all the language and math standardized test scores of every 10th grader in the whole country, and also whether or not they had a fixed mindset, or whether they were somewhere in between. So what did we find? Well, the results surprised even us. We found that students who had a growth mindset were 3 times more likely than those with a fixed mindset to score in the top 20% of students nationally. We found that students with a fixed mindset, on the other hand, were 4 times more likely to score in the bottom 20% of students nationally. And importantly, this strong relationship between mindset and achievement remained significant, highly significant, very strong, even when we held constant for a number of other factors. Factors like what school the students went to, how much money their parents made, whether or not they had an internet connection at home, how many books they had, literally dozens of factors that are important predictors of achievement. Well, hopefully by now, if you didn't believe this already, I've done a good enough job convincing you the growth mindset is a much more adaptive perspective on intelligence than a fixed mindset. Hopefully you understand how it helps people focus on how they can improve rather than how they might be judged. How in doing so, it sets people on a more successful and far less fearful trajectory when it comes to learning and challenges. Well, I first learned about Professor Dweck's research about 8 years ago now. At the time, I was a research assistant at the University of Chicago, and it resonated with me deeply. I looked back on my own life, and I could see times when a fixed mindset and a growth mindset had both played a role at different time points. I could see how they had shaped my path in various different ways. It became painfully obvious to me that there had been many times in my own life when a fixed mindset had held me back, when it prevented me from taking on a challenge that I would have otherwise wanted to, because I was afraid that I would fail and that such a failure would lead me and others to question my abilities, my talent, or my intelligence. It was a really painful realization, but it was also an empowering one, because I knew that from that moment on, I would know better, and I would not let myself fall into the same fixed mindset traps. In fact, I was so taken by this research that I went to Stanford University to study with Carol Dweck. Once I got there, I read article after article after article, showing that carefully designed interventions could change how students think about learning and help them change their mindsets and help them do better by doing so. For example, growth mindset interventions developed and tested by Joshua Aronson, Kathryn Good, and Lisa Blackwell all showed that it was possible to change how students think about intelligence, to help them develop a growth mindset, and that doing so could help them actually do better in challenging situations. Well, I was really inspired by this work, by this research, but I was also frustrated. And I was frustrated because the people who most needed to know about this work, parents and teachers, weren't going to find out about it or learn how to do it by reading about it in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology or in Applied Developmental Psychology. In other words, there was a really big gap between what we in the research community knew about these mindsets, how important they are, and how to instill them, and what practitioners knew, what the people who most needed to know about them knew. And that meant that a lot of students who could have been benefiting from this work weren't. To fill this gap, I co-founded the Stanford University Project for Education Research That Scales, or PERTS. I did that with my co-founders, Carissa Romero, Ben Haley, and Chris McRander, most of whom were graduate students at the time. Our goal at PERTS was to discover and to promote practices that can help students adopt more adaptive beliefs about learning, beliefs like the growth mindset and others. Well, in the 5 years since we started PERTS, we've seen time and again just how important and just how powerful students' mindsets about learning can be. We've seen that even brief growth mindset interventions can help students come to see intelligence as something they can grow and help them succeed in school as a result. To give you just one example, we recently published a study that tested a brief growth mindset intervention with a sample of over 1,500 high school students from all around the country. We found that relative to a randomly assigned control group, the intervention successfully helped more students understand that intelligence is something they can grow. In other words, to develop a growth mindset. Importantly, we also found that it helped struggling students, students who were at risk for dropping out of high school. It helped these students, the students who were earning poor grades prior to the intervention, it helped them earn more A's, B's, and C's in the semester after the intervention. In other words, these struggling students who were most likely to have fixed conceptions about their abilities and to be held back by those conceptions, all of a sudden became more likely to actually succeed in school. So findings like that have really encouraged our team. They've inspired us to redouble our efforts to get out the growth mindset message in the most effective, most evidence-based ways possible. For example, we're working now with the Khan Academy to find ways to incorporate growth mindset into their educational software. We're working with the Teaching Channel to record and to promote videos of teachers who do an outstanding job communicating growth mindset through their teaching. And we're working with Ivy Tech, the state of Indiana community college system, to develop and to test interventions designed to help students see intelligence as more malleable and hopefully help them actually succeed in college and be more likely to complete. So I guess you could say that now I'm a sort of professional growth mindset evangelist. And in that spirit, the Ed Sessions team asked me to come here and provide some recommendations regarding what we can do to unfix our mindsets. So how can we unfix our mindsets? What can we do? So I have 4 recommendations for you today, and I'm going to discuss them each in turn. Recommendation number 1 is to learn the evidence. Learn the science behind a growth mindset. Without that kind of scientific grounding, it can be really easy for people to dismiss growth mindset as wishful thinking, to think that growth mindset is just some kind of feel-good story you tell kids to motivate them. But what does the science say? Well, until pretty recently, many in the neuroscience community believed that the human brain didn't change much past early childhood. In fact, that consensus gave a type of scientific backing to a fixed mindset view of intelligence. After all, if the brain can't change much past early childhood, how can we possibly get smarter? But today, we know that in fact, the brain can and does change a great deal past early childhood. For example, a 2011 article published in the journal Nature, arguably the most prestigious scientific publication in the world, reported on a study by Sue Ramsden and her colleagues. These researchers had teenagers complete an IQ test 2 times. First in 2004, and then again 4 years later in 2008. At each time point, they didn't just complete an IQ test, they also had their brain scanned using an MRI machine. Well, these researchers found 2 very interesting things. First, they found that the teens' IQs shifted substantially over this 4-year period. Almost a fifth of their participants had IQ shifts of 15 points or more. That's a standard deviation on the IQ scale. Furthermore, they found that the changes in the teens' brains were associated with significant shifts in the volume and density of gray matter in the teens' brains. So their brains changed, and so too did their intelligence. Another study, published just this last year, in 2014, examined the brains of adults who had learned to read for the first time in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and in some cases even in their 50s. This article showed, and the brains of these adults showed substantial physical changes as a result of learning to read, and specifically in those parts of the brain related to reading that are involved in being able to successfully read. In other words, the brain adapts. When we challenge it, it adapts to meet that challenge. Learning to read, even at this very late age, caused the brain to reorganize itself in such a way as to facilitate reading. So these findings, and others like them, show pretty unambiguously that the brain continues to change. The practice and learning can continue to rewire the brain throughout life. They undercut the core of the notion that our abilities are limited by a static and unchanging brain. Now, you don't have to read the peer-reviewed studies to learn about this. You can just Google neuroplasticity, as this phenomenon is called, or you can read about the brain's ability to change in popular books, like The Brain That Changes Itself, a bestseller. My point is that the claim that intelligence is malleable is much more credible and much more powerful if one understands the mechanism by which this process takes place and understands that there's a lot of scientific backing for its truth. A second bit of evidence to know relates to IQ tests. Now, you might hear or you might read that IQ is stable. And you might interpret that as evidence that someone's intelligence doesn't change, as evidence supporting a fixed mindset, in other words. Indeed, I can't blame you, because it would be easy to interpret the term stable to imply stability, to imply that something doesn't change. But it turns out that this is an unfortunate example of scientific jargon being misrepresented or misinterpreted by the public. What do the data actually show? What do researchers actually mean when they say that IQ is, quote, stable? Well, when researchers say that IQ is stable, they're talking about studies in which people take an IQ test 2 times. And what they find is that usually the results of the IQ test taken at time 1 statistically predict the same person's IQ scores at time 2. So how stable are those scores actually? Well, it turns out that over long periods of time, a person's IQ test scores at time 1 predict about 50% of the variance. 50%, not 100, 50% of the variability in the scores at time 2. Now, 50% consistency might not sound all that stable to you. But as a social scientist, I'll tell you that it's pretty stable compared to a lot of phenomena that social scientists study. So when social scientists say that IQ is stable in their articles, they understand that it's stable relative to other phenomena they study. But in other words, they understand that there's a great deal of variation. So it can be kind of hard to visualize what 50% stability looks like. In fact, I wasn't quite sure myself what that would really look like. So I thought I'd make some visual aids to help you see it. So let's say you take 100 people and you have them do an IQ test. And then you order them from left to right, with the people getting the lowest scores on the left and the people getting the highest scores on the right. That means that the person in spot number 100 got the worst score the first time, the person in spot number 1 got the best score the first time. Then you test them again years later. What order are they in? Are they in the exact same order as you might think if you really believe, in a very literal sense, that IQ is stable? Yeah, so with all the talk of intelligence being stable, you might be inclined to think, that the person who ranked number 3 the first time would end up in spot number 3 again. The person who ranked 42nd would end up in spot 42 again, and so forth. Or maybe you'd think that there's a little bit of variation. Maybe the person who started out in spot number 31 would make it all the way up to number 26. Or the person who started out in spot 5 would have dropped down to spot number 9. But for the most part, you might think from a word like stable that they'd stay in pretty much the same order. Well, you can probably guess that that's not what the real picture looks like. In fact, it looks a little bit more like that, except that, of course, I couldn't make enough arrows to show just how jumbled this picture would actually be. It turns out that on average, people would move 18 out of 100 ranks. Over a third of people would move by 20 or more ranks. About a fifth of people would move 30 or more ranks. And about 1 in 10 people would move 40 or more ranks. So this lineup is far from stable in the colloquial sense of the term stable. It's actually shifting a great deal. So this is hardly the kind of stability that might justify the claim that people's intelligence is fixed. In fact, it seems like to imply just the opposite. It seems to imply that for most people, intelligence changes a fair amount. And for many people, for a pretty sizable minority, it shifts a great deal. But wait, there's more. There's a big caveat in the numbers I just shared with you. Because of course, they don't represent how much people's intelligence could change. They represent how much people's intelligence has changed in our society. Our society, which is chock full of fixed mindset messages. Just imagine a student who started out scoring on the left side of the visual I just showed you. A student who maybe is struggling in school, and isn't doing so well. Well, that student might be told that, might be given the impression that they're really just not smart and there's nothing they can do about it. They might be given a fixed mindset. So they'd probably think that no matter what they did, they couldn't become smarter. So like many students with a fixed mindset, they'd be inclined to avoid the types of intellectual challenges that could actually help them grow. They might also be shunted to remedial academic programs that wouldn't challenge them to grow, programs with lower expectations, that would deny them the opportunity to do the exact kinds of things that could help them grow. So just think how much more those students could have improved had they been armed with a growth mindset, they and their teachers and their parents. No doubt they could have become a great deal smarter if they had understood that they could increase their intelligence by trying hard and by challenging themselves. Time for recommendation number 2. And this recommendation is don't forget the growth and growth mindset. So a growth mindset is not just optimism, okay? It's not merely the belief that effort and perseverance can help you accomplish some particular challenging task. It's the belief that effort won't just help you accomplish a task, it's that it'll actually grow you, that it'll develop you and make you better. Put it another way, people who have a growth mindset don't just do hard things because they think they can. They do hard things because they understand that in doing hard things, they will actually improve themselves, that those hard things will no longer be hard, that they'll become easier, and that they'll be able to move on to bigger and better and harder things. Now, this is really worth noting because I've heard a lot of people miss out on this ingredient, to leave out this key ingredient when talking about what growth mindset is to others. For example, I've heard great, well-intentioned teachers say things like, I encourage all of my students to have a growth mindset. If they're struggling, I tell them, just try harder, stay positive, you can do it. But notice, nowhere in these statements is growth implied. Where's the growth? Let's focus in on the first statement so I can explain exactly what I mean. You can do it if you just try harder. Well, that's a really good message, and it is consistent with a growth mindset insofar as it's focusing on effort as the key to success. But it's leaving out that critical piece about effort improving oneself. And that leaves it open to very different interpretations. So just imagine a student with a fixed mindset struggling to do her math homework. And her teacher walks up and with the best intentions at heart says, "You can do it if you just try harder." How do you think that student, if she has a fixed mindset, might interpret that statement? What do you think she'll hear? Well, I propose that she might hear, "You can do it if you just try harder because you lack natural ability." If you were a natural, of course, you wouldn't have to try so hard. It's because you lack ability that you have to try so hard. In other words, the student would be able to take this very different idea from that statement. And she might become discouraged rather than encouraged and motivated. So remember, the growth mindset isn't just about staying positive or about giving it your best shot. It's a scientifically grounded understanding of the fact that through practice, we can fundamentally improve ourselves and put ourselves on an upward trajectory. Time for recommendation number 3. And this is a tough one because it literally involves doing tough things. So recommendation number 3 is to push yourself hard enough that you struggle, that you make mistakes, and that you have to ask people for help. And this is important because even if you have a growth mindset, if you're never actually pushing yourself, if you're never actually struggling to improve yourself and your abilities, you're not going to get better. Now, at first, I acknowledge this can feel rather uncomfortable. I know firsthand that it can. But I also know that that discomfort fades with time as you get more accustomed to thinking in a growth-focused way. As you shift from thinking about where you are right now and what that means about you to where you want to be and how to get there. As that happens, that state of learning, that state of challenge, which is initially uncomfortable, gets to become your new comfort zone. And that really is a great feeling. Now, it can be really hard to make challenge your comfort zone, even if you're in a really supportive environment. But it's harder still if you're in a workplace or a home or a classroom that has a fixed mindset culture. And that's why it's critically important for those of us in a position to set the norms, be we teachers, managers, or parents, to establish a growth mindset culture, a culture that nurtures this challenge-based kind of norms. So how do you do that? How do you create this kind of culture that nurtures challenge and a growth mindset, that really gets people out of their comfort zone and developing this new challenge-based comfort zone? Well, first, I might recommend giving challenging work, but saying explicitly that you expect mistakes, and the mistakes will help you and the person who makes them identify areas for improvement. Saying this up front really changes the equation. It shifts the focus from judgment to growth. It shows people that you're intentionally pushing them to help them develop and that you're okay with them making mistakes. It puts them into an improvement mindset in which mistakes are far less threatening, where they can really feel comfortable challenging themselves. Second, when someone does make a mistake, acknowledge it and focus the person immediately on the learning opportunity there. You know, sometimes we can be really uncomfortable pointing out when someone's made a mistake. We don't want to draw attention to it because we worry it'll make them feel bad. But that actually sends 2 negative messages. Well, first, it robs them of an opportunity to improve themselves. But second, it also reinforces this idea the mistakes are so bad, so embarrassing, that you're not even going to acknowledge it. Because if you did acknowledge it, of course they would have to feel bad about it, right? So not acknowledging it can have this very perverse effect of making people feel even less comfortable, feel like mistakes aren't okay in that particular environment. Finally, a great way to set norms around mistakes and challenge is to model what you want to see. Make mistakes publicly if you're the leader, if you're the teacher, if you're the manager, if you're the parent. Make mistakes publicly, acknowledge your mistake without self-judgment. Don't be upset with yourself for having made the mistake. Try to model what you want to see. Try to say, oh, I made a mistake. What can I learn from it? What can I take away from this to help me improve? So years ago, I might have thought that this was all some pretty fanciful, theoretical stuff. I might have been skeptical that you could actually pull this off in practice and really change a culture in this way. So let me give you two real examples of growth mindset cultures that embrace mistakes. My first example comes from the classroom of Marielle Triggs. Now, Marielle is a high school math teacher in San Francisco. After a math test in her class, one student has to go up to the overhead projector at the front of the class and show their mistake, dissect their mistake in front of the whole class. Now, I want you to imagine that. I bet a lot of you are sweating right now just thinking about it. But if I think back to my high school class, I know I would have been terrified to do this. But in her class, going up to the overhead to explain your mistake is something that students fight over. They want to go up and show off their mistake in front of others. And why? It's because she's communicated such clear norms around the value of mistakes that students in her class understand that mistakes are a key part of learning. They know that their peers won't judge them, that they won't think that they're dumb for making those mistakes. Quite to the contrary, they'll admire them for acknowledging their mistakes publicly. And they'll admire them for being resilient enough to talk about those mistakes publicly and learn from them in front of others. Think about how different it would be to be in that kind of math class than one in which mistakes are stigmatized. How much more interesting and how much more lively that would be, how much less worried you'd be, how much freer you'd be to experiment and really learn. A second example of a mistake-tolerant culture comes from Silicon Valley, which is arguably the most innovative and commercially successful business cluster in the whole world. This is where Apple, Google, Facebook, eBay, Intel, Oracle, and thousands of other high-tech companies have their headquarters. People there openly talk about their failures as learning experiences, a lot. A recent New York Times article talked about Silicon Valley as a place where people wear their failures on their sleeve. In fact, there's a whole business conference there called FailCon, which is devoted entirely to people discussing their failures. Imagine that. Isn't that different? There, much like in Marielle's math class, entrepreneurs discuss their missteps in front of their peers so that their peers can learn from their mistakes and also so they can show off just how much they failed and learn from that process, so they can show off how resilient they are. Of course, nobody sets out to fail. I'm not saying you should set out to fail, but I'm saying you should set out to put yourself in such a challenging situation that failure is likely. Because if you're not willing to fail, then you're way less likely to put yourself into those kind of challenging situations that help you grow. If you're too afraid to fail, you're unlikely to try to do something challenging. Furthermore, if you're truly terrified of failure, then when you do fail, you're far less likely to view that as a learning opportunity. And you're far more likely instead to pretend that it didn't happen or to try to pretend that it's somebody else's fault. Okay, last but by no means least, monitor for fixed mindset thoughts. Learn to recognize the difference between growth mindset statements and ideas and fixed mindset statements and ideas. Now, sometimes it can be pretty obvious. Let me give you two examples. A statement like, "you have no talent," is a pretty obvious one, right? Or, "you're just not a math person," right? So both of these statements convey the idea that a person lacks some deep, internal, unchangeable quality. They're fixed mindset statements, but fixed mindset statements don't always have to be negative. Sometimes they can focus on what a person has or seems to have rather than on what they don't have. Claudia Mueller and Carol Dweck conducted a series of elegant studies to examine the effects of different kinds of praise. I'll describe one of these studies in detail to you because I think it so clearly demonstrates how well-intentioned compliments, well-intentioned praise can backfire and convey a fixed mindset message that subsequently undermines motivation. So in this study, they had 10-year-olds start by doing some moderately difficult IQ problems. These are called Raven's progressive matrices, and if you don't know how they work, you have to try to complete the pattern. So they started out with these moderately difficult IQ questions. And then after doing a set of them, and of course, keep in mind, these are some pretty unusual problems. Students aren't used to doing these, so they don't really know if they did well or if they didn't do well. So that gave them the luxury of being able to tell everyone that they actually did well. But they randomly assigned what kind of praise they gave them. So to some students, they gave them intelligence praise. They praised something that students might have perceived as being internal and unchangeable about them. They said, "Wow, that's a really good score. You must be smart at this." To others, they gave them effort praise or process praise. They said, wow, that's a really good score. You must have tried really hard. And finally, to the control group, they just said, wow, that's a really good score. Then all the students took this much more challenging series of IQ questions. And then, well, first of all, they could tell that these were harder. It was much harder to find the pattern. But then after this series, after this test, they were all given negative feedback. They were told, well, that's a lot worse. And then they were asked to do another set of IQ problems, this time of equal difficulty as that first set of problems they did. So let me just review the procedure for you. So the students first completed moderately difficult problems. They were randomly assigned to different kinds of praise. Then they completed these hard problems and experienced a setback. They were told they didn't do so well. And then they completed the same difficulty questions again. So note that at the beginning and at the end, the questions were about the same, of the same difficulty. So here I'm going to graph for you how well they did in that trial 1 and in that last trial, the two trials that had, in which they were about equal difficulty. So students in the control group, those who were just told, wow, that's a really good score, well, their scores didn't change much. They stayed right about the same. Students who were praised for effort, who learned that effort is what's important, that effort is how you do well at these problems. So in the set of hard problems, they had a chance to practice that. They had a chance to really try hard and put in a lot of effort. And so unsurprisingly, maybe, they got better, right? They got a lot more practice. But what happened to the students who were praised for their intelligence, who were told, you must be smart at this? Well, they did a lot worse. After their initial success, the intelligence praise led them to believe that their good performance was the result of something special about them. You're so special, you're good at these questions. Not due to what they had been doing, not due to the effort they were actually putting into it. Now, of course, this might have felt good to the students at the time, but it also implied that this success requires being special rather than working hard, rather than using the right kind of strategies. So then their subsequent difficulty with trial 2 must have meant that maybe they're not so special after all, that they had peaked, in other words, with that first set of problems. So then, of course, they were discouraged, and they disengaged from these problems, doing much worse. And I want to point out that this can be a really common problem with bright kids. They get accustomed to hearing how smart and talented and gifted they are, and how they're so special because they succeed in school. And then they seem to have all the confidence in the world, but it's brittle self-confidence. Because when they eventually encounter something that is challenging, something that really pushes them, it throws their whole self-image into question. If before they were successful because they were special, then maybe they're not so special now that they're not successful. And it wasn't learning or effort before that made them successful, it was just their being special. I'd like to end by just summarizing about how to think and talk and think with a growth mindset. So remember not to focus on qualities that people commonly interpret as stable, like talent or intelligence. Now, of course, you all now know that intelligence isn't stable, but a lot of people don't. And so it can be better not to focus on that, but instead to focus on effort and strategies, to focus on how you or others can improve, what you can do to make yourself better, and to focus on mistakes and challenges, not as bad things to be ashamed of, but as opportunities to grow oneself. And on that note, I'd like to end and open the floor up for questions. Thank you.